Hello friends and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. Friends, we were on Unit 10 discussing Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan. The first topic which we discussed in this poem Kubla Khan was the, let us say, this disbelief, and now in today's class we are going to talk about the next topic, that is fancy and imagination. Just like dissociation of sensibility, this topic fancy and imagination was also discussed by Coleridge in the book Biographia Literaria, and how it is applied in Kubla Khan we are going to discuss about it in this lecture. But before moving to let us say the content of the lecture, let me tell you what are you going to learn, what will be the outcome of this lecture. Friends, this lecture will be of 30 minutes, and after let us say completion of this lecture you would be in a position to discuss the concept of fancy and imagination with reference to Kubla Khan. So, without wasting any time, let us now move to this interesting concept of fancy and imagination and how it is applied in the poem Kubla Khan. The role of imagination is both expressed with the poem Kubla Khan and plays a strong role in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's explanation of the writing process. Friends, when we talk about this poem Kubla Khan, we not only have to focus on the two metaphors which the poet is trying to discuss, maybe the metaphor of the, let us say, damsel with a dulcimer, or the metaphor of the construction of Xanadu, but we also have to focus on the way the poem is written, the language, and the explanation of that writing process need to be done on the grounds of fancy and imagination. What is the writing process? How would you know? Let us say if someone asks you this question, that what is the writing process of this poem, you would say that the foundation of the writing process is the concept of fancy and imagination. The unity of vision is extraordinary. From the first mention of Xanadu, a word that comes to stand for any kind of vast, measureless to men, magical territory. So, friends, when we talk about the, let us say, unity in vision, because it is a kind of defragment, poet is trying to remember what he has seen in the dream, and then he is trying to compile, let us say, all the visions he had seen in the dream into, let us say, the form of a poem. So, when we, let us say, talk about this castle, that palace Xanadu, the word that comes to stand for any kind of vast, measureless to man, magical territory. So, Xanadu is something for us that is a very huge kind of palace, something which we cannot imagine, something very grand, measureless to man. This place is measureless, we cannot even measure, let us say, the ecstasy, the exoticism and the magic which exists in this territory. Kubla Khan celebrates the imagination, especially the imagination of the poetic genius. So, friends, this is an excellent example of imagination, the poetic genius of the poet. What poet is trying to, let us say, explain, that is something which we need to understand on the basis of the content of this poem. The poem takes us on a journey from the ordinary imagination to the powerful prophetic imagination of the genius. Friends, all of us, let us say, see dreams, sometimes daydreams, sometimes we sleep in the day, and all of us know how to imagine something. But the powerful and the prophetic imagination which is expressed in this poem Kubla Khan is something which shows the genius of Coleridge, the excellence the command over language and how he channelizes his thoughts, that is something which makes him, sometimes I feel that his writing style is even better than William Wordsworth. All forms of imagination are good, but the prophetic imagination is more dangerous. So, there is a kind of, let us say friends, prophetic imagination. It transforms our mind. When we go deep into this imagination, sometimes we believe that it is a kind of inception, we cannot come out of this. The dream becomes real for us, and thus it is a very dangerous situation. One may also ask, what does the sacred river symbolize in Kubla Khan? Friends, there is a reference of Elf river in Kubla Khan, and let us say we may ask this question to ourselves, that what is the, let us say, sense of introducing a river in this poem. Even though there is a river Elf in Antarctica, the river mentioned in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan is fictional and represents the power, force and excitement of natural world. Friends, there is a purpose with which Coleridge has introduced this poem. The poem, this river. The river is the representative of power, force and excitement. Now, you may also feel it. Suppose you are going for river rafting in Rishikesh. When you are in the river and the water is flowing with, let us say, immense speed, you will feel the power, force and excitement of that water, that river, the power of that river. In the same way, Coleridge is trying to explain the power of this river by, let us say, this poem. It also represents movement down to a sunless sea. So, friends, another representation of the poem, this river, is that it is, let us say, representing the movement down to a sunless sea. The river is moving somewhere down, even where sea, let us say, cannot, let us say, see the sun, down to the sunless sea. Sunless sea means the sea is so dark inside, and in that darkness the river is going to meet the sea. So, we can assume that generally we say that sun is the most powerful element on earth, but here Coleridge is trying to convert it, and he is trying to say that the darkness or the sea or the power of water is more important, is let us say, is better than that of sun. Likewise, what is the main idea of Kubla Khan? Is it poetic imagination? One theory says that Kubla Khan is about poetry, and the two sections discuss two types of poems. Friends, critics, when they interpret and they come out with lots of interesting facts about the poem, they thought that this is a kind of, let us say, poetic imagination. There are two poems clubbed into one poem. You can imagine that what kind of, let us say, experiment Coleridge has done into this poem. So, Kubla Khan is not only about let us say, imagination, it is also about writing poetry in a unique manner. The power of the imagination is an important component of this theme. The poem celebrates creativity and how the poet is able to experience a connection to the universe through inspiration. So, friends, this poem is a, let us say, mixture of imagination and inspiration. Two major elements. If anyone asks you, and let us say if this question can also be asked in the exam, that what are the, let us say, two hidden characteristics and the most important characteristics of the poem, you will say that the one is imagination, the power of imagination, and the other one is the power of inspiration, a connection to the universe through inspiration. What are we getting from this inspiration? A connection with the universe, the element of the romantic poetry which makes this poem romantic. We are in align with all the objects of the universe. We are unified, we are not individual, we are not independent, but we are dependent on this universe. The experience which Coleridge has felt into, let us say, the impact of opium was the align, let us say, the relation, the, let us say, mixing with the outer nature or the universe. What does the pleasure dome symbolize in Kubla Khan? When we move forward, we see that there is a, let us say, a reference of pleasure dome also in this poem Kubla Khan, and we have to see that what does this, let us say, pleasure dome signify, what is its purpose, what is this dome, or what kind of pleasure is it trying to give to everyone while reading the poem. The dome. The speaker seems fascinated by the symbol of Kubla Khan's pleasure dome and repeats the imagery at different points throughout the poem. Now, friends, what is a dome? It is a kind of, let us say, construction, you will say. It is a kind of, let us say, building which is related to the imaginative world of Coleridge. But the domes, you will find various kind of domes in the surroundings, but a speaker is fascinated by that pleasure dome which was building, or which was, let us say, Kubla Khan as a ruler is trying to construct in that paradise. The speaker feels fascinated. The poet Coleridge, he is, let us say, completely out of his mind when he imagines the grandness, the beauty, the, let us say, difference which this pleasure dome is making in this paradise, and repeats the imagery at different points throughout the poem. Poet is so, let us say, excited that he kept on repeating about the imagery of this pleasure dome again and again in the poem. The dome can be seen as symbolizing the act of creating a poem itself. Now, friends, why poet is talking about this dome again and again? The reason is, just like poet is constructing poem one step, another step, then third step, then fourth step, step by step construction. In the same way, the dome is also getting constructed step by step in the poem. So, when the poem moves ahead, the dome, the construction of dome also moves ahead. Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan, the transcription of a dream vision, allegedly unfinished due to interruption, created much controversy and plural interpretation. Now, friends, you might say that when we talk about controversy, we may think that controversy can be created with the obscene texts, vulgar texts, or something related to, let us say, disturbing religious harmony, or sometimes use of, let us say, cliches in the language of the fiction. But there is nothing like that in Kubla Khan. Still, the transcription of the dream vision which poet has made through this poem, and this poem left unfinished because of the interruption of a, let us say, visitor. We have discussed it in the last class. It has created a kind of controversy and plural interpretations of the poem. Now, what is this controversy? Controversy lies in the concrete interpretation, the actual interpretation, the plural interpretation made by the critiques. So, this is very important. You have to understand that this poem is so multi-layered, this poem is so complex that a poet has to, Coleridge has to now appear and explain that what he is actually trying to say through this poem Kubla Khan. Critics are still, let us say, analyzing this poem, still trying to, let us say, converse, interpret, and try to peel off the hidden layers of this poem, this dream fragment Kubla Khan. This, however, did not bother Coleridge, who stated in an unpublished notebook that poetry gives more pleasure when only generally and not perfectly understood. Now, the Coleridge as a poet, as you know, is trying to increase this excitement in the mind of the readers. Although he had not published it, but in an unpublished notebook, maybe in general notes, he had said this about the poetry writing, that poetry gives more pleasure when only generally and not perfectly understood. So, when we generally understand the poem, but do not go into depth of the poem, the different layers can be analyzed, only then we can feel the pleasure of the poem. Maybe the poet is trying to say that poetry is not written for understanding, the poetry is written for pleasure, and that pleasure you can achieve only when you read the poem in a general manner, rather than trying to critically analyze the step by step, let us say, the partition of the poem. The poem has been interpreted as a musical composition, romantic inspiration, pure lyricism, a poem about poetry, an unconscious revelation of personal fantasies and repressed, usually erotic urges, a landscape poem and a poetic daydream, a political statement and a theological exploration. So, I think that in these 7-8 points, the complete, let us say, interpretation of poetry, the complete thematic analysis of the interpretation of poetry can be done. People read poetry as a musical composition, like something is created to sing, or let us say a romantic inspiration. If you are, let us say, under romanticism, you will read the poem and you will be inspired, or the poetry is about pure lyricism. You like the lyrics, you like the lines, you like the rhythm and rhyme of the poem. Sometimes a poem is about poetry, how the poetry need to be written. Sometimes the poem is about an unconscious revelation of personal fantasies. There are some things going on in the mind of the poet, and those personal fantasies are, let us say, poured out in the form of a poem. Sometimes it is a repressed, usually erotic urges. There are few things which lie in the unconscious mind of the poet, and poet want to take them out, those urges, those erotic urges, those repressed urges, those repressed desires come out in the form of the poem. Sometimes it is a landscape poem, talking about the outer landscape, the beauty of the scenes which poet has seen through his eyes. Then sometimes poem is about poetical daydreams. In the day, you are in a virtual world, you wish to share that with the readers. Sometimes the poem is about a political statement. I have written few poems talking about the political statements, because I like to write the poems in the form of heroic couplets or in the form of iambic pentameter. So, if you want to use satire as an element, then you would use the political statements in the poem. Then sometimes the poem is also about a theological exploration. You are trying to explore your religion, aligning with the other religions, and what is the significance of religion in the world and in your life. These things are also explored through a poem. The interpretations can be mythical. Friends, when we let us say try to interpret a poem, sometimes poem is interpreted in a mythical manner, a myth, sexual with phallic and womb symbols. Sometimes when we look at the poems, they are sexual in nature, with the symbol of phallic, phallus, or the womb symbol, or the womanly, let us say, elements in that. Allegorical, the imagination. Sometimes the poem is trying to, let us say, create an allegory of imagination, where caverns equal the mind, river, water, milk of paradise equals the imagination. And when we are in that dream, we feel that the river or water or milk of paradise are equal in the imagination. They are not separate entities, and maybe in that way when we look at this poem Kubla Khan and the existence of river, the river may not represent the river exactly or the water exactly, but it might represent a different kind of strength, power or flow or supremacy when we analyze the hidden symbols of the poem Kubla Khan. Tangential with the stream of consciousness. This is also true. Sometimes poem represents the stream of consciousness going on in the mind of the poet. The flow of ideas, the free flow of ideas, poet cannot control it. The contradictory with the use of contraries. Sometimes the poem is about talking about contradictory ideas. The use of contraries, how let us say the contradictory ideas are represented in the poem. For example, the stately pleasure dome, eyes caverns as culture or nature. So, when we look at the examples of this poem, there is a phrase, the stately pleasure dome. The dome which is being constructed in the poem, that is something stately, something pleasurable, something unimaginable. And then when the poet portrays the, let us say, scenic beauty, poet says, eyes caverns as culture or nature, suggesting a kind of, let us say, ice caves which we cannot imagine, maybe find in Himalayas, remote areas of Himalayas, but those ice caves are imagined by the poet in this paradise of the king Kubla Khan. A man of contraries, Kubla Khan is powerful and dangerous, yet capable of building an exquisitely beautiful palace and gardens. Friends, if we go into the history of this king Kubla Khan, because he is a true historical character, he is not completely a fictional one, we see that the Kubla Khan's personality, although powerful and dangerous, but was with full of contraries. His attitude was let us say mysterious, and yet he was capable of building an exquisitely beautiful palace and gardens. This is something surprising, because a complex person cannot create such an organized construction of exquisitely beautiful palace and garden. So, this is something which is beyond the true Kubla Khan, but with the strength of Coleridge, this person Kubla is able to create that organized and beautiful palace and garden in the poem. The supernatural qualities of the content create an ethereal fantasy. It is, as Hill states, so provokingly enigmatic, with mystery and ambiguity, verisimilitude and teasing suggestiveness, essential ingredients. When we, let us say, look at the supernatural qualities of this poem, the ethereal fantasies which are visible in the poem, there are, let us say, critics like Hill who give this statement that it is so provokingly enigmatic, with mystery and ambiguity. There is a mixture of feelings into this poem. We have mystery, ambiguity, we have verisimilitude, teasing suggestiveness, essential ingredients, and all the things when mixed together, there is a, let us say, a kind of dish which is served in front of us which we have never seen in our life. My interpretation of Kubla Khan aligns with the landscape poem and poetic daydream, but guided by the intent of poem. When I looked at this poem Kubla Khan, I found that this poem aligns with the landscape poem and poetic daydream. We can consider it as a landscape poem, just like Ode to Autumn, or there are poetical daydream poems also, earlier written by many writers, and the successors of S.T. Coleridge as well had written about poetical daydreams. So, we can align this poem as a with a mixture of these concepts, and they are guided by intent of the poet. I believe that he deliberately laid the poem out as he did, with 4 alternate descriptive and remunerative stanzas. So, when I analyze the language of the poem, I found that the poem is let us say talking about 4 alternative, descriptive and ruminative stanzas. What are those 4 stanzas? Let us talk about them one by one to critically analyze this poem. In the first stanza, Coleridge imaginatively describes Xanadu, evoking an enchantment with language that blends the natural with the man-made. So, when we begin the poem, we see that Coleridge is trying to describe the Xanadu. He is imagining the dream is still under the construction process, and there is an evoking an enchantment with language that blends the natural with the man-made. We are unable to understand whether it is natural or man-made, because the poet is so organizedly writing the poem that we may think that this is something true, something real. The pleasure dome, the wall and towers were girdled round, that is enwrapped by beautiful gardens where blossomed many an incense bearing tree. When we look at the, let us say, scenic beauty of this place, the pleasure dome, we see that they were gilded, let us say gilded round, surrounded, and this is enwrapped by beautiful garden. There is a beautiful garden which has surrounded this pleasure dome, where blossomed many an incense bearing tree. Some trees which are suspicious, some trees which are so beautiful and mysterious, like the tree of knowledge in the paradise, from where Adam and Eve had eaten the fruit of knowledge. So, such beautiful trees are, let us say, grown everywhere around the pleasure dome. As if wreathed by the magical incense from the gardens, the man-made elements took on their same supernatural quality. So, there is a supernatural quality, something supernatural, something beyond the human reality, beyond the present world, which exists, the magical creation of this garden. Fantasy driven by the imagination and its blending of man-made and natural elements to form a believable cohesive unity called Xanadu was deliberately created. Poet is deliberately, friends, creating these kind of scenic beauties. He want to create that kind of supernatural and imaginative effect. We are completely under the fancy world of S.T. Coleridge when we read this poem. That is something which is beyond the, let us say, imagination of a common man. Coleridge is able to do it. Although he was recording the contents of a dream as a result of opium induced inspiration, nevertheless, Coleridge was still the author, in control of the words he wrote, the images he used and the atmosphere he created. So, we see that in the impact of opium, Coleridge has written a kind of poem which is beyond the common imagination. So, the atmosphere which he is trying to create is something which is completely different from the present imagination. He continued this physical blending of the binary opposition, man-made, nature, in the third stanza, summing up Xanadu, the outcome of the blending with the lines. When we move further in the poem, we see that there are binary oppositions which are visible everywhere in this fancy and imaginative world created by poet, and that binary opposition include the man-made or, let us say, artificial and the natural. So, what is natural and what is man-made? Maybe Coleridge is offended from all the industrialization which is happening in England, or maybe the constructions which are man-made around, and maybe he is missing nature. He want to go under the lap of nature, which is why he is creating this Xanadu, which is completely natural, which is completely different. And this blending of man-made with nature is visible in these lines from the poem, and I quote, "It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice." So, there is binary opposition. If the weather is sunny, then how can ice remain in the caves? The ice will melt. But poet, in a, let us say, this kind of contradictory imagination, trying to imagine that The sunny pleasure dome is also there, and the caves of ice are also there. So, there is a miracle, it is a rare device. This, what is device? Device is this pleasure dome which is being constructed by Kubla Khan. I believe this is a blatant acknowledgement of Coleridge's deliberate control of his fantasy, the vehicle for the expression of his dream vision and an expression of his theoretical individuality. So, I can conclude by saying that the blatant acknowledgement of Coleridge's deliberate control of his fantasy, how, let us say, Coleridge is trying to control the fantasy world, the vehicle for the expression of his dream vision. He is trying to, let us say, create the poem which is an expression of the dream vision of the poet's world and an expression of his theoretical individuality, suggesting that poet is, let us say, staunch believer of individuality, the theoretical individuality, and which is why he wish that everyone must see the similar kind of dreams and everyone must, let us say, create his or her own fanciful world and imaginative, let us say, ideas which Coleridge has. Coleridge was able to create under the influence of opium, and then this poem, beautiful poem Kubla Khan, was constructed. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.